Unlike Tertullian, Chrysostom, and as we'll see, Jerome, believed that Peter and Paul acted out and perhaps coordinated the confrontation. Chrysostom thus believes there was not a real or sincere rebuke or confrontation. He finds it inconceivable that Peter would have actually feared the Jews or Judaizers in Antioch, and believes that Peter gave Paul a pretext for rebuking him, characterizing it as a scheme or feint. At one point in Jerome's commentary, the way he describes what Paul does is that he cautiously takes the middle ground between praising and rebuking Peter so as to defer to his apostolic predecessor while at the same time opposing him. But Jerome goes even further in his theory about what happened between Peter and Paul. Unlike Tertullian, but like Chrysostom, Jerome believed Paul was acting in public as if he were contradicting Peter, making it appear like there was a real rebuke going on when there wasn't. Jerome saw no problem in such a temporary deception and goes on to give biblical examples to justify it. Jerome believed that Peter and Paul, like great lawyers or orators, actually feigned or faked a quarrel or holy dispute in order to bring about peace, unity, and harmony. Now, if one is to believe the provocative theory mentioned earlier, that this incident led to a large, widespread schism in the church, such play acting on the part of the apostles would have been completely counterproductive and done just the opposite of bringing about peace, unity, and harmony. However, we see a hint here, as we'll see in other places, that Jerome himself was not completely satisfied with this explanation of his, but he thought it was the best one available because others before him held to it, and because he apparently thought it unlikely, if not impossible, that Peter was in any error, or that Paul rashly rebuked Peter for doing the same thing Paul had done. Like Chrysostom, Jerome found it inconceivable that Paul really opposed and fearlessly insulted his predecessor, Peter. Otherwise, it would make Paul out to be the bigger hypocrite, not Peter, since Paul would have on many occasions been guilty of the same kind of dissimulation or insincerity that he accused Peter of. Again, Jerome zealously and jealously guarded the reputations of Peter and Paul, because, like Tertullian in relation to Marcion, Jerome had special motivation to do so, considering how the pagan philosopher Porphyry used the dispute between Peter and Paul to discredit and undermine Christianity as a whole. But again, here we see that Jerome was still somewhat open to alternative interpretations from Augustine, though vigorously defending the position of those who came before him. One thing we can certainly learn from Jerome's commentary on this Galatians 2 incident is to be very careful to avoid sin and scandal, and to be very cautious and prudent in how we talk about church scandals when they do occur, because the enemies of the church have always been watching from the 1st century to our own 21st century. It reminds me of Clement of Rome's letter to the Corinthians, and how he points out that they have scandalized believers and non-believers alike by their sedition and deposing of the rightful leaders of that local church. In his letter to Augustine, Jerome explicitly appealed to Origen and John Chrysostom for his preferred theory of a staged confrontation, though some claim that Origen never promotes this interpretation in his surviving works. Lastly, it's worth noting that besides the two theories, one saying that there was a real confrontation and the other saying there wasn't a real confrontation, there was also a less popular theory that the Cephas confronted by Paul in Galatians 2 is actually a totally different person from Peter the Apostle. This was apparently a theory of Clement of Alexandria and Theodore of Mopsuestia. Here, Jerome directs this theory, saying, "We do not know any other person named Cephas besides the one who shows up in the Gospels and other Pauline letters," and saying, "The entire argument of the epistle, namely its subtext about Peter, James, and John, militates against this interpretation." He also doesn't see any relevance in Luke omitting the event from his Acts of the Apostles, suggesting perhaps Luke thought the incident worthy of being forgotten or consigned to oblivion. As awkward and uncomfortable an event as it is for both Peter and Paul, clearly the Holy Spirit did not think that, and so we must grapple with it as best we can.